Hello readers, I'm the Avid reader, and today we're gonna rank all 9 books by George Orwell. So I'm gonna exclude the books that are collections of essays by him. So I'm gonna be ranking the 9 books that he wrote between 1933 to 1949. And George Orwell wrote a few books, actually, not just his 2 famous books, Animal Farm and 1984. He wrote in total 6 novels and 3 non-fiction books. And I usually preferred his fiction to non-fiction. So let's get started. So at the bottom of the list, ranking number 9, I would put A Clergyman's Daughter, which is about a British girl who works for some clergyman who goes on a journey. And this is the most boring novel I have read by George Orwell. It's the only book I wouldn't really recommend by him. But there's one really good section in this book about the school system, where teachers have to teach stuff because of pressure from parents, such as memorizing all the counties, but that's not really learning in a fun and constructive way. But apart from that section, this is a pretty boring book. There's a theater scene in Trafalgar Square in this book. There's also a scene where they're hop pickers or whatever that was. So yeah, I didn't like A Clergyman's Daughter. Coming in at number 8 is Down and Out in Paris and London. So this is a memoir of George Orwell's poverty in Paris and in London, and it's interesting, but there's also a lot of socialist messaging in this book which I didn't like, and there are some sections that are a bit boring. So it's interesting to understand the hierarchy of the French hotels and the difference between homelessness in France and the UK, and also how the poorhouses work in the UK. That was also interesting, but this is the least good non-fiction book by Orwell. Then at number 7 you have Homage to Catalonia, which is a memoir of George Orwell's fighting days during the Spanish Civil War. And he served in PUM, which was a militia that was accused of being Trotskyist. And it's an okay book. The only part I really liked in this book was the appendix, last 2 chapters, where George Orwell talks about the politics of the Spanish Civil War and how you have a double standard between anarchists and communists, where the communists are disarming the anarchists. And yeah, you get to understand the internal politics of Catalonia during this period and how the communists eventually dominated the Republican side. Coming in at number 6 is The Road to Wigan Pier. So this is George Orwell's best non-fiction book. I liked the first half of this book, which is about the working and living conditions of British mine workers who work in North England. So you get to understand how hard and long the day of a miner is, and also you learn about the squalid learning conditions. What I didn't really like about this book is the second section, which is Orwell making a case for socialism, which I don't agree with. And he argues that people oppose socialism for some irrational reason, and he tried to make an argument to convince people, but his arguments for socialism weren't convincing in my opinion, as the socialist-capitalist debate is about economics, not morality in my opinion. Coming in at number 5, and now we're coming to the good books, is Keep the Aspidistra Flying. And this is a book basically about a guy going around ranting about if you want to have any worth in life, you need to be rich. And he's getting drunk. He's hanging out with his rich friend who's saying, no, that's not true. And his rich friend kind of treats the main character as the charity case. And there's also a relationship between the main character and a girl. And yeah, and you have a kind of tragic comic ending in this book where they get together, if I remember right, but then they argue about some dumb stuff. So this is the first entertaining book by George Orwell on the list. It's weird because there's socialist themes in his novels, but I like most of George Orwell's novels because they're written in a fun and entertaining way usually. Coming in at number 4 you have Coming Up for Air, which is basically a novel about a guy getting away from his wife, going back to his ancient hometown to explore stuff. You also have the theme here of a society going more and more jingoistic, so he gets to see some politics and some political meetings, and there's also a historical guy that the main character hangs out with, and there's also an annoying wife in this book who gets angry at him towards the end of the book. This is another tragic comic book, I would say, by George Orwell. Coming in at number 3 is my favorite non-famous George Orwell book is Burmese Days, which is a book about a British guy who's in Imperial British Burma, which is kind of like British India at the time, and it's taking place, I think, in the 20s or something like that, or the 30s. And it's inspired by George Orwell's service in Imperial Burma or India, I think. And this book is a tragedy. It's an interesting book where you have the main character who's opposed to British imperialism, and then you have this Indian doctor who says, no, the British are actually quite nice. And then you have this local Burmese guy who's a politician who's scheming to increase his power. And it's a tragedy. It ends in a really tragic way, this book. It's one of my favorite tragedies of all time that I've read. And it's also an interesting novel about imperialism in general. Coming in at number 2 is, of course, Animal Farm. And this is a very short book. Most of George Orwell's books are about 200 to 300 pages. This one is less than 100 pages long, I think. Yeah, it's an allegory to the communist revolution. So you have allegories here to Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin. And it's an allegory of how Stalin consolidated power and created the totalitarian state. And you also have the famous saying here that all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And I would interpret this as basically saying, okay, all the workers and peasants are so-called equal, but in the end, the Communist Party members are more equal than everyone else, which is what the pigs represent, in my opinion, the Communist Party members. It's a weird book, but it's a great allegory to the pitfalls of communism. Of course, coming in at number 1 is 1984. This is a quasi-perfect book, in my opinion. There's a love story also in this book, but what's especially important in this book is the analysis of totalitarianism through the plot. For example, in the middle of the book, there's a section explaining how actually the totalitarian state works. And 1984 is perfecting totalitarianism of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And you see how the government knows everything you do and they try to control what you do. There's also the idea of newspeak, so you're removing more and more concepts so people can no longer think, as you need words to think. One of the reasons that the Anglosphere is the freest region in the world is because they have a very developed language which allows you to think. And this book has a bad ending, and there's a clear hierarchy in the totalitarian state, and the living standards of most people are declining and becoming worse and worse. And if you want to kind of understand what North Korea is like, then this is a pretty good guide, I would say, even though this book was written before North Korea was founded, in a sense. So this is the perfect political novel, and it is my favorite George Orwell book. So I hope you readers enjoyed this book ranking. I finished reading all of George Orwell's 9 books 2.5 years ago, and most of them are good, so I would definitely recommend them. The non-fiction stuff is decent, but it's still kind of interesting. But especially 1984 and Animal Farm are 2 very important books to read if you want to understand politics. And if you want to learn more about my thoughts of George Orwell's books, then you can check out this playlist here, where I have reviewed 7 of his books. Anyways, I'm the Avid Reader, and I will see you readers next time.